In every corner of every country on earth, there are wandering legends. They adapt to their surroundings by playing out there, and they refuse to die. These stories, whether they're about haunted hospitals on the outskirts of a city, a monster inhabiting some forest, or an apparition wandering the country roads alone, have one more thing in common. No one telling the stories has ever experienced them themselves. Everyone says the same thing. They know someone whose brother's best friend's sister must have visited the haunted house, where the third floor was flooded with blood, snakes, and spiders, and is so scary that no one ever made it out alive. They swear it's true, but can never produce a single piece of evidence or name anyone who can attest to having been there themselves. But there is no need. Everyone in the area knows it is a true story. The stories are passed down from parent to child and changed so that they feel true and current, and the circle is tied and repeated. I'd think I'm more skeptical than most of these kinds of stories, largely because I was so incredibly fond of them myself as a child. The first thing I did when I arrived in a new place in the country was always to look up the local horror stories of the area. In the end, I started to invent little tales myself about haunted factories in Stockholm, my cousin's encounter with the Great Lakes monster, and how my grandfather one night encountered a ferocious, human-like demon in the woods outside Boden. Sometimes I even broke the only rule there is, not to place myself in these made-up stories. It required being a little extra cheeky and brave, because then I had to stick to one and the same version of the stories all the time. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluffs. I like the idea that I might have been able to contribute to the various hiking legends and myths around Sweden. Every time I heard a classmate retell one of my heist stories in the hallways of my makeshift school, it felt just as intoxicating, especially as I noticed how they added some detail of their own to heighten the suspense, as if it was one big whisper. I knew for myself that the stories were pure lies, but I stood my ground when someone asked and sometimes even got involved with a bit of acting. Trembling in the voice, a frightened expression on the face, that sort of thing. It is probably these aspects of my upbringing that ultimately led to the experiences I now intend to talk about in their entirety, and then you can make what you want of it. This introduction is a kind of hearth pat aimed at those of you who question the whole order. Sure, I've been the boy who cried, "The wolf is coming," for years, but this time I swear on all the words of honor I have left that the wolf actually existed. Those of you who listened to my introduction may have figured out that I moved around a lot during my school years. My parents weren't in the military or wanted or anything. They just didn't seem like the type to stay in one place for long. It certainly had some kind of effect on me, but I can't say it's been directly negative. During my childhood, I was the constant clown. I made new friends easily and was often the center of attention. But this also led to many of my teachers disliking me, which in itself was no big problem, because when the next semester started, I was often in a completely different city anyway. My relationships with my classmates were superficial, not to mention the teachers, who didn't exactly dislike me. Because of what would later occur, my memory of a particular teacher is probably a little distorted, but I'll try to tell this story as matter-of-factly as I can. My teacher in 9th grade was called Mike Johansson. Now, in retrospect, I completely understand how difficult young people at that age can be, and I have enormous respect for how he was able to handle and actually bond with students. He managed to feel like one of us. He talked like we did. He made pop culture references that didn't actually feel tired and out of date, and he listened to great music. Occasionally, during a lesson about things like Sweden's abuse of the Sami or the Second World War, he might even utter a passionate swear word. A teacher swearing was the most rebellious thing I could imagine an adult doing in middle school. Much of my memory of Mike stems from the impression that he really went for things. In particular, I remember one time in the fall term in 9th grade, around All Saints' Day. Mike had put up some Halloween decorations in the classroom, pictures of pumpkins and cobwebs in the corners, things that we naughty teenagers snorted at. But on the Friday before All Saints' Day, he took being cool as a teacher to a whole new level. When we walked through the classroom door that day, We were greeted by a dimly lit room, the blinds drawn, and the windows covered with black sheets. On each school desk was a lit candle, and Mike sat at his desk and watched us students as we entered and sat down. He didn't have to quiet us down. We quieted down on our own, either too confused or too excited for this exciting change. After everyone was seated, Mike went and sat on a chair in front of his desk, whereupon he spoke in a low voice. "This is probably the day of the year I like the most," he said in a toneless voice. "All Saints' Day is my favorite holiday, and now I want to tell you why." A girl with a worried expression raised her hand, but Mike waved her away. "You don't have to turn in that homework until next Tuesday," he said without even looking at her. She lowered her hand and looked around the classroom blushing, while everyone else erupted in quiet, cautious cheers. Mike waited for it to settle, and then continued his story. I intend to try to retell the amazing story he told that day. He managed to leave us horror fans speechless, and the rest of the class terrified. The girl who raised her hand to ask about the homework sat at the end of the lesson, curled up on the chair with her arms around her knees and fear in her eyes. Some details I have forgotten, but they were still not important. It started when Mike and his friends went on a road trip in Europe after high school. They had filled an old minivan with tents and sleeping bags and just driven off to spend the summer seeing the continent. The gang went from Stockholm all the way down to the Riviera, east to the Balkans, and up through the eastern states to Denmark and then back home. This experience captured every single travel-hungry teenager in the class at once. Mike instantly became the coolest teacher I had ever met. They didn't have plans, maps, or a date when they would be back home in Sweden, so they simply drove in the direction they felt like and usually eventually found a village or town where they could sleep over. Finally, after driving through Poland and Germany, they found themselves on the country roads through the Danish fields. They knew the journey was coming to an end, so they gathered the last of their money and went to the nearest settlement to find somewhere to rent a room for the night. After finding a hostel that Mike forgot the name of, one of his friends found out that his uncle lived in the area. He wasn't quite sure where, but since they were adventurous youngsters, no one had any objection to simply going out and looking. They demanded the money back from the hostel and left. They borrowed the phone from the hostel, but couldn't get hold of the uncle, so they thought it would be fun to show up as a surprise. Mike's friend was completely convinced that he would welcome them with open arms, so just over an hour before the sun went down, they set off with the hope of getting there before it was far too late. In the area, there weren't many landmarks for lost travelers to latch onto. When they asked for directions, they got at best a vague briefing about following the field until they saw a tree, and then following the field to the right until there was wheat roadside. So, as is customary in horror stories, the group got lost, but refusing to admit it to themselves, they drove on into the night, and after taking the wrong turn every other way, they finally found themselves on a forest road that Mike's friend was sure led to his uncle's house. Mike described the forest road as the dark path that leads to hell. I wasn't quite sure he was telling the truth then, because he got a little carried away and started describing the tree branches, as seeming to reach out to grab the car and saying that on the sides of the road there were countless red eyes of animals watching them in the dark of night. But these horror cliches seemed to have the desired effect. My classmates were terrified. The gang continued down the dark forest road for about a quarter of an hour until they reached a clearing with a lighted building and a silo in the middle. They had somewhat prejudicially thought that everyone in those parts knew each other, and therefore believed that someone in the house would at least be able to point out the direction to the guy's uncle. After parking next to the building, they realized only then that it was more of a barn than a residential building. But the lights were on indoors, so they thought they might as well try. The front door was a sliding door that stood half open, and when the friends entered the building, they found it contained a single, large, and completely empty room. On the ceiling hung fluorescent lights that were so bright it looked like broad daylight in there, but there wasn't a soul in there. One of Mike's friends said they saw something moving when they drove up to the building, so they went in anyway and looked around to make sure they didn't miss out anyone. If there was no one there, then why would the house be all lit up, right? The walls of the building were bare and nothing was to be found inside. It was basically just a big, empty hall. The friends wandered around and examined the clearing for a while. As they approached the silo, they noticed what looked like a door to an earthen cellar. Here, Mike interrupted the story to urge us students to learn from his stupidity. In his defense, he said that he hadn't seen many horror movies when he was that age, and that it therefore seemed like a good idea to bang straight into a rickety cellar door out in the woods in the middle of the night. In retrospect, he said, and here he got something serious in his eyes, that it had been a big mistake to open that door. Before he continued, Mike said that he now intended to tell just as much detail as he thought we were ready for. He said it might be a bit much for listeners afraid of the dark, and advised those who didn't want to stay to leave the class early. A few students quickly gathered their things and headed out the door, some of which probably just wanted to take the opportunity to smoke behind the school before the next class started. I myself never even considered leaving. As I said, I was a big consumer of cheesy horror stories, and Mike was a better storyteller than most people I had met. I didn't believe too much of what he said, but I wanted to see if I could learn something from him. After seeing the classroom become a little more sparsely populated, Mike continued with his story. He looked at those of us who remained and said that he and his friends, after breaking open the earth cellar door, smelled a whiff of the most putrid, sour stench they had ever experienced. In an instant, the gang stopped wondering where that uncle lived and were now wholeheartedly intent on finding the source of the smell instead. They went down the steps inside the door and ended up in a long hallway lit by bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Silenced by the wonder of the place, they walked slowly forward in the hall, the walls of which were covered with metal sheets. The hallway was crooked and had varying ceiling heights, as if it had been excavated but never fully completed. Every now and then they had to crouch to get to the front. The worst, according to Mike, was that the bulbs were constantly blinking and flickering. Sometimes they behaved like disco balls, making it even more complicated to navigate without occasionally hitting your head. In retrospect, he thought it was because of the flashing light, but then he was sure he saw things peeking out of the corner of his eye that couldn't possibly belong there. When you're very focused on something, or when you're nervous, the brain can rebel, he said, constructing visual or auditory impressions that don't actually exist in reality. He described how the hallway wound on, seemingly forever, and that he figured they were somewhere under the dense, creepy forest they had driven through to get there. I was totally into his story. After walking for what felt like a mile, they were finally greeted by a door. It looked like it had been stolen from a nice house in the suburbs, not deep down a mysterious underground passage in the middle of nowhere. Made of wood and seemingly recently painted red, it sat there, adorned with a shiny, clean handle and a doorknob. One of Mike's friends walked slowly up to the door as the flickering light bulbs cast flickering light over it. Then he turned back to his friends and tried to lighten the nervous mood by grinning and saying, "Maybe I should knock first." He grabbed the doorknob and slammed it against the door a few times, after which he jokingly mumbled, "Anyone home?" 30 seconds passed without anything happening, while the silent congregation stood still and watched the door. Finally, the guy in front of the door shrugged and started walking back to the others. Then the light bulb closest to the door sizzled and exploded. The friends instinctively crouched and closed their eyes. When they looked up again, they saw how one of the metal sheets covering the roof came loose at one end and fell, the sharp edge hitting the guy closest to the door. It cut a bleeding wound into his forehead. He fell backward, seemingly unconscious, hitting the door, which flung open. The friends rushed towards him, without thinking about the pitch-black room that now lay open before them. Mike was first, lifting his friend's head in his arms as he pulled off his jacket to stop the flow of blood. It was chaos for a minute or so, but eventually everyone calmed down. Mike was sitting in the room just inside the door, with his friend in his arms, pressing his jacket against the wound on his forehead. He noticed that the arm he used to prop up his friend's head was soaked through and was just about to find out why when he was interrupted by another of his friends. "We have to leave," he said, or something like that. It was only then that Mike saw. "You know when you turn off a light," he told us in the classroom, "and everything is almost completely dark except for the fading yellow light in the bulb? This is what it looked like inside that room, but with a whole lot of lights hanging from the ceiling. Or probably 20 lights shone in such a shadowy way, like little stars in a night sky. It was eerie, but certainly not the scariest part of the whole situation. In the light of the flickering bulbs in the hall, they saw the silhouettes of about 10 people standing no more than 3 feet into the room. One of Mike's friends took a step forward to say something when one of the light bulbs inside the room blinked and turned on. Let me pause the story here and say something about what Mike used to be like. He was quite a relaxed and carefree person. He often spoke in a tone that kind of made you want to respond with something happy, positive. He could say, "Listen, come and we'll jump off a cliff together," and people would still have replied, "Well, of course, Mike, let's go." Okay, maybe a little exaggerated, but you get the point. He was charming, and so far, he had told his story in a campfire way, in an artificially low and dramatic voice. Sure, it went home in class, but I noticed. At this point in the story, I remember all that changing completely. He was no longer trying to scare us. This part was genuinely hard to talk about. Either he was a really good actor, or this was actually a painful memory for him. The light bulb in the room then blinked on and illuminated the people standing in the room in front of them. In the dim, shadowy chamber, children were visible, at least 20 as far as the light could reach. They were all wearing nightgowns that looked dirty and stretched out, with large dark stains on them. Their hair was long and didn't look like it had been cut since they were born. Some of the children's hair reached down to the ground. Not one of them looked like they had ever taken a bath or a shower. Most frightening of all, Mike said, was that none of them moved. They stood still and stared at him and his friends. In some, the light of the bulb was reflected in a half-hidden eye behind the hair strands. The two groups stood perfectly still and looked at each other, but with Mike and his friends there was a paralyzing terror that prevented them from moving. A few seconds passed, then a whining sound was heard in the distance. He described it as the sound of a dog crying, but times 10. This broke the group's freeze, and they groped for their passed-out friend to leave. Then the dirty children suddenly took a small step forward. The friends tore up the passed-out friend and stumbled out into the hall, and with their eyes fixed on the dirty and now slowly advancing children, Mike groped with his hand along the wall of the room to find something to lean on. He grabbed a handle, pulled himself up, and plunged out of the room while managing to see, for a fraction of a second, what he was holding. 2 feet in against the cement wall in the room, a bit above the handle, a shower nozzle stuck out from the darkness. Something leaked out of the shower, which in the dark only looked black. It had dripped down on him too, but he didn't care what it was. In the room, the children rushed toward him. In the background, the scream of the unknown animal, or whatever it was, and his friend was badly injured. The last thing he saw in the room before rushing out were more shower heads sticking out of the wall, lit by the light bulb. "That's the reason I call that place the shower," Mike told us. I was completely engrossed in his story and sat on the edge of my seat with a burning desire to hear more. He continued, "I flung the red-painted door behind me and bolted down the long corridor faster than I had ever run before or since. We finally made it to the minivan and did a 180 from there. So, to end this story, remember to keep track of where you end up when you're knocking on doors looking for trick-or-treating this weekend." Mike thanked us for listening and ended the lesson. He turned on the ceiling lamp, reminded us to hand in our assignment next Tuesday, and wished us a nice All Saints' Day weekend. All around me, my classmates stood up and excitedly began to chatter about the story they had just heard. I myself was completely taken. Mike had told his story in a masterful way, but certain details made me suspect that we had not been told the whole truth. A few days later, I hung around after the lesson ended and asked him what had really happened. He laughed, leaned forward, and said in a theatrical whisper that it probably had something to do with them being a little high that day. Then he winked at me as if to ask me to keep that secret, and I smiled and walked away. I graduated 9th grade in that town. A few weeks after I finished school for the summer, we moved away, way up north. In the years that followed, I told Mike's story at a whole bunch of campfires, and it was a constant hit. However, I used to change the ending, having Mike's friend either die of blood loss or be dragged away by the children. Not until I had started college did I get the chance to meet and talk to Mike again. By then, I had ended up in Stockholm, though not because it had anything to do with this story. High school was a fun and eventful period for me, and I was still the same clown I had been in high school. My education was 4 years, and only in the 3rd year did I run into Mike at a bar where we used to hang out and drink beer. At first, I wasn't sure if the baggy person I saw lying with his head against his arm on the table was really my old teacher. What made me recognize him was a shirt he had worn on his birthday once, with a cake as a motif. I told my friends to sit down and that I would only be gone for a moment. Then I walked over to the man's table. The man looked up. His misty gaze swept over my face. Then he smiled, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "But hey, how have you been?" His breath smelled of booze, and his cheeks were flushed red. From the look on his face, he didn't have the faintest idea who I was. "Mike, it's me, Jack. I had you in history class for a few semesters, maybe 7 or 8 years ago." His expression changed, and something sharp recognition formed in his eyes. He relaxed, smiled, and said, "How's it going, Jack?" We started talking, and as it was, 20 minutes had passed. I told him what I had been up to the past few years, and he told me about his life. He still worked at the same school, going through the same grotto mill, as he put it. I asked several times if everything was fine with him, and he said it was as good as it could ever be. Slowly, a realization sunk in. I was an adult having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had talked to Mike before, it had been as his student, and our conversation had been characterized by him being my teacher, but this time I was just a dude having a drink with an acquaintance. A moment later, my friends waved from the door to go on. I stayed and drank whiskey with Mike. He told me about his divorce and his children, things I had never been mature enough to ask about before. Now I cared. He was a real person to me, not just a figure in a lectern anymore. He had a life of ordinary, real problems, just like everyone else. Only after a few hours did I pick up his story about the shower. I first told him about my relationship with walking legends and horror stories, and he laughed. But when I mentioned that lesson he had with us, he started to screw up a bit, as if it was something he'd rather not talk about. He swiped his glass, waved to order another, and turned to me with a serious expression on his face. "Jack, I don't know why I persisted in telling you that year after year," he said. He was slurring a bit. Or maybe I was a little hard of hearing, because we were both pretty packed by now. It must have been because my therapist once, when I was younger, advised me to talk about all that stuff, get over it, or whatever the hell she meant. "Your therapist?" I said. Mike laughed dejectedly and glared at me. "Of course. You do realize that such an experience doesn't exactly go unnoticed?" I smiled in confusion. Everything had just taken a strange left turn. "But you said you were all just high on smoke, right? No one was hurt, and everyone returned home safe and sound. Or?" In a few moments, his lower lip began to quiver in an almost ridiculous manner. "No, damn it! Don't you realize we didn't? I didn't understand anything." 1,000 questions popped into my head, but I let him continue talking. "Rickard, damn, he didn't make it, Jack," he said with a shaky laugh as his eyes filled with tears. "They took him. I couldn't understand it. The police said we had been too drunk and he just got lost in the woods. He didn't know. He didn't see them, Jack." Now I sat as if petrified. Mike Johansson talked on, as if I knew what had really happened, but I didn't. His friend had disappeared that night. I hadn't understood that. I just wish they had found his body. Then we would have been able to prove it to the police, he said, sobbing. "That was a nasty place, Jack. I have nothing more to say about it. It is an evil, horrible place." He talked on for a few minutes about his old friend Rickard and all the fun they had together, and I couldn't bring myself to interrupt him. After a few minutes, he called the cell phone. "Hey, baby," he murmured into the receiver. "I'll be back very soon," he said, stifling a wet rap. I heard the person on the other end hang up, and Mike got up from his chair. "It's been fun talking to you, Jack. You're sharp, you. Make sure to do something about it." He took his hand, turned, and started to walk. "Mike," I called after him. "All that shower stuff. Where did you say it happened?" "Where?" "In hell," he said. "Somewhere outside Silkeborg and Jutland in Denmark. As close to hell on earth as you can get, if you ask me." Mike waved tiredly and continued towards the door. Or he first went into the wall next to the door before finally finding his way out. And that was the last time I saw him. I was never given the opportunity to share the profound meaning his story would have on my life. He never got to hear about the journey I made after leaving school, and how it resembled his own in almost every detail. He never learned that the things he saw in the barn that night were real, because a month after I met him, he died. His liver gave up, but his family was gathered around him on his deathbed, and he died surrounded by those he loved. That's all you can ask for. Here, my story changes, from being someone else's to becoming my own. But I can start by saying that it took a few months for the news of Mike Johansson's death to reach me. My first thought was to find his family to personally deliver my condolences, but then I realized I wasn't like his best friend or anything. I held back, and a few years after we met in that bar, I graduated and left college. My decision to study political science wasn't exactly a mistake, but it wasn't exactly something that resulted in immediate job offers. However, I had saved up some money and thought that after finishing school, I deserved a real vacation. So I teamed up with my classmate Jonas, and we packed ourselves into a plane and headed down to Berlin. I had been there as a teenager and remembered loving the city, but wanting to experience it as an adult, so it felt like a reasonable choice. The trip was a success. We rented an apartment in Kreuzberg and stayed there for a month. During the day, we went to town, watched movies, and in the evenings, we drank good beer and met new friends. After the month had passed, we found a website where you could go home for just the cost of living by driving a car that would still be shipped to Stockholm. We went slowly up through Germany and stopped here and there, including in Hamburg. There we met a group of Germans in a bar who invited us to a party, and for lack of better ideas, we joined. It was a quiet event that doesn't really have anything to do with this story, but at some point during the evening we got into a ghost story telling circle. These days, I'm not quite the clown I used to be, but I still can if I want to, and after a few classics I found myself returning to Mike Johansson's story about the showers. Every time I had told it myself, I had added some detail of my own, embroidered it a little, but due to some sort of subconscious respect for Mike, who was now gone and unable to tell the story himself, I stuck closely to the version he told that day in junior high school. My stories went home, but everyone's unequivocal favorite was the showers. Jonas and I went home from there at 5 in the morning, and in the car, he asked to know more about the showers. I told him about Mike, about the lesson, about my relationship to horror and wandering legends, and Jonas immediately suggested that we should try to find that building on the way up to Stockholm. At first, I was hesitant, mostly because I didn't feel like spending a week wandering around Denmark looking for a barn that must have been demolished long ago. But I thought about it for a day or so and realized that maybe was the only time I would get the chance to see the place for myself. So, I said yes. In the back of my mind, I also had the idea that I could make the trip as a kind of homage to Mike, who, after all, was the one who made me realize that I wanted to work in writing. Anyway, we left Hamburg, crossed the border into Denmark, and soon found ourselves in central Jutland, Denmark. Hell on earth, as Mike Johansson had said. We found a hostel in Silkeborg and spent a few days driving around the fields around the town, in search of the forest in which the house was hidden. We asked people in the area if they knew something about the place, but was usually met with blank stares and rolling eyes. The only person who seemed to have somehow heard of the showers was an old woman who worked at a gas station. I don't remember her name, but she was the kind of happy aunt who was about to retire, and therefore indulged in being a little extra polite and chatty with everyone who passed. She had commented on our license plate and asked if we were out traveling, and then Jonas mentioned that we were out looking for a place known as the Showers. At first, the name didn't seem that familiar to her, but when I described some of the details from Mike's story, she suddenly interrupted me. She didn't sound angry or upset, but she suddenly sounded sharp, and like she was suddenly choosing her words more carefully. "People around here don't do anything like that anymore. That was a long time ago," she said. Then she tried to sound as happy and carefree again, but soon excused herself, saying she had some work to do and wished us a pleasant trip up to Stockholm. Jonas and I went back to the car, both full of thoughts about what the woman said and what she might have meant. She certainly didn't sound angry, but she didn't seem to want to hear another word about that place. On the way back to the hostel, Jonas spoke up. "If I lived in a place where people sometimes came and asked around about old local hiking legends, I would definitely have messed with them a bit. Eventually you get tired of them and scare them a little, just so they keep their mouths shut, right?" I agreed and we drove on, but something about the whole situation was wrong. If this was a famous local walking legend, then why was it only the woman at the grocery store who reacted like that so far? Why had everyone else reacted like we had just made the whole story up? Finally, I shook off the question. Note that none of us were directly afraid of looking for the Showers. The whole thing felt more like a little treasure hunt to top off an otherwise quiet and relaxing holiday. Jonas and I felt like tourists looking for the place where a famous movie was shot, or something like that. We had low expectations and weren't even fully convinced that we would find that building at all. After spending a quiet day in Silkeborg, we went in search of the barn again. Denmark isn't as horrible as people try to make it out to be, but it just isn't all that exciting. At best, you find a bar where you can drink a beer, and that was about what we had done on our day off. Once back on the road, we decided to explore as much of the country roads as we could. There was no way this place would be on the edge of the highway either, but I remembered Mike saying something about a dirt road, so we set out to look for just such. It was easier said than done. At 7 o'clock in the evening, we ended up in a small forest. I'm using that word a bit broadly here, but for being in Denmark, it was pure primeval forest. The trees were large and thick and cast a deep shadow over the ground. As the sun was setting, we figured this was probably the last chance for the day, so we looked for the small dirt road leading into the forest and followed it. We rode slowly and carefully, and occasionally had to get out and clear the road of a fallen log. It had probably been quite dark in there in the forest even before the sun went down, and now it was almost pitch black. I had a feeling I was on the right track, but didn't want to jinx it, so we just drove on. In retrospect, I've come to think that the streaks of light from the setting sun actually made it look like the trees were reaching for the car, just like Mike had told me. I'm still sure he made up the red eyes of the animals, though, because the scariest animal thing we saw in the woods was a dead hare by the side of the road. It looked like it had simply laid down and then never bothered to get up again. We drove around in the dark for a while until we saw a clearing some distance away. On the way there, however, the car was stopped by a giant fallen tree across the road, which we could hardly move. We got out of the car and turned on its headlights to illuminate the road ahead as best we could. We both felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement as the cone of light illuminated what lay 20 feet in front of us. There, lit partly by our car lights, but also by the moon that had now risen, lay what looked like an old barn. It was larger than they usually are and had no ornaments, but looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't quite sure yet that it really was the place Mike had told me about, but it was definitely the most likely place so far. I walked through the bushes until they seemed to stop completely, a few feet from the doors of the building. Maybe the landowners had done something with the soil there, but around the house, nothing seemed to be able to grow row. It was just flat, not even any grass. I approached the doors and realized it was a large, sliding door when Jonas appeared behind me with 2 flashlights. "Were you planning to run in there yourself in the dark?" he said, laughing. I replied with a half-hearted laugh and took one of the flashlights, a slightly smaller but very bright model. Then I felt the sliding door put the flashlight in my mouth and gave it a push with both hands. It moved an inch and made a creaking sound, but I could hardly get it up under my own power. Jonas and I counted to 3 and then took in together. Slowly it was pushed up until it seemed to fall back into its rails and gently began to slide up, finally stopping with a thud. I walked in with Jonas on my heels. The interior of the barn was completely stripped, almost frighteningly clean. I wasn't quite sure how far from the nearest farm or village we were, but there were no signs whatsoever that anyone had been in there for years. No beer bottles, chip bags, farts, or spray bottles left behind, not even any animal droppings or plants pushed up through the floor. The room itself was larger than an ordinary barn, but not as gigantic as it had sounded in Mike's story. I figured it had probably been some sort of warehouse for farm stuff or something at some point. Disappointed, I walked around aimlessly while Jonas quickly slipped into the shadows to explore. After I thought through the details of Mike's story, I was struck by something. He had talked about a silo. I ran out and looked around, jogging a lap around the barn to be sure, but despite my hopes, nothing appeared. If there had ever been a silo here, it must have left some sort of trace behind, but the only thing there was the thick underbrush that surrounded the clearing, and beyond them, the trees that disappeared into the darkness. Feeling frustrated, but even more tired, I went back inside. Jonas was still jumping cheerfully around the building. If I could just find a shower head, or just a pipe, we'd all know it's true. "Come on, do some searching," he said. I didn't want to spoil the excitement for him. Sure, I had told him Mike's whole story several times, but he certainly hadn't yet realized that this must be the wrong place. The building was strange, yes. It didn't really belong there, and was strangely untouched for seeming so abandoned, but it simply couldn't be where the showers were. I let Jonas search for a while longer, then I yelled at him. "Okay, this is about as close as we'll get to that place," I said and continued, "but it's wrong. Do you remember that thing about the silo?" His expression went from excited to disappointed in an instant, like a child who has just opened the only Christmas present and realized it was socks. I patted him on the shoulder and felt an old habit come to life again. "Still awesome we made it this far," I said. "After all, if people ask, we can still say that we found the place." Jonas laughed. "Damn it, we can. It's definitely scary enough here." "We should take some pictures as proof, eh?" I nodded in agreement. "I'll go out to the car and get the camera," he said and headed out the door. I found myself alone in the building. It became very quiet. I heard Jonas's steps fade out outside the door, through the bushes to the car, but when they disappeared, nothing was heard. Not a gust of wind or cricket or bird, nothing. I wandered into the darkness with the flashlight in my hand. There must be something somewhere. It couldn't be completely empty. I approached the far end of the room when the sound of my footsteps suddenly sounded hollow and muffled. I backed up, stomped on the ground, and realized I had found a gap under which there was air. I stood by the wall and examined the floor from the side. Neither holes nor pits were to be seen, and nowhere did the floor appear to be supported by posts or beams. In other words, the building must rest against a solid foundation, and what I just discovered is a hatch down to some sort of basement. As I heard Jonah's footsteps approaching outside the door and began to call out to him, I took a small leap so he would hear the hollow thud as I landed on the hatch. "Jonas, look here! It's a hatch!" The second I said door, I landed with my feet on the ground and felt it give way under me. I don't really remember the fall, but I do remember hearing wooden boards breaking. Then I remember the cone of light from Jonah's flashlight swishing past my eyes, blinding them for a second, and then leaving me in complete darkness. The fall hadn't been high, but I must have landed hard because I lost consciousness for at least a few seconds. When I sprang to life, it was to the sound of Jonah's desperate voice. "Jack, can you hear me? Hey, wake the hell up! I narrowed my eyes and nodded at him, and he cried out in relief. My head hurt, and I suspected at once that I had a concussion, but that was nothing compared to the pain in my knee. I fumbled for my flashlight, found it, and got up and called out to Jonas that I was okay, but that I had hit my knee and head hard. I thought you were dead. Imagine if you had died in Denmark, damn it, that would have been terrible, he shouted back. I laughed but had to stop because the slightest movement of my head sent a flash of pain down my neck, making me dizzy. Jonas continued, "Do you see a ladder down there? Otherwise, I might have to go and fix a rope." I looked around and found only bare cement walls. No way I could climb that way. "Yes, get a rope," I told him. "It's somewhere at the bottom of the trunk, in my red climbing bag, I think." Jonas nodded, laughed nervously, and told me not to go anywhere. Then he got up and ran away. Again, I was left in silence. As Jonas stepped towards the floor above me, echoed out, I heard only that buzzing one's ear produces in silence, interrupted now and then by the sound of my own loud pounding pulse in the temples. I crawled over to the nearest cement wall and leaned against it. In retrospect, I remember that the wall was unnaturally cold. Since this was a hot summer night, I was only wearing a t-shirt, but it felt icy cold against my back. But right then I mostly thought about how nice it was to lean against something. As I sat there in the strange basement of the strange house, waiting to hear the return of Jonah's steps, a vague feeling of uneasiness crept over me. I sat feeling like an idiot for falling down, and was racked by my pains, but both of those feelings disappeared at once when I heard what must have been someone's breathing to my left. I whipped my head around, forced to close my eyes to endure the wave of pain that followed, but saw nothing there when I opened my eyes again. I quickly convinced myself that it must have been imagination, until Mike Johansson's story popped into my head again. When I first heard it in the classroom that day many years ago, I was more impressed than intimidated, but now, in this condition in this room, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. My stomach clenched, and cold drops of sweat were squeezed out of every pore on my body, like squeezing a damp washcloth in your fist. I was terrified. I pointed the flashlight to my left. Its light didn't reach all the way to the wall, but I saw nothing there. I sat hyperventilating for a few seconds, staring into the darkness, when a sound in front of me made me jump. It was brief, and may have been me doing it somehow, but it sounded like something was scraping against the floor just a few feet in front of me. It sounded like footsteps on a dirty floor. I turned the flashlight forward, but before I could look, I heard breathing to my left again, a little closer this time. This couldn't be true. It must have been me imagining it. I hadn't seen so much as a cobweb in the building, and now suddenly, something breathing next to me? I got mad at myself for not being able to keep calm. I thought feverishly of something I had learned in school, that the human brain, lacking external visual and auditory impressions, creates them by itself, and focused on that thought to calm myself. It worked. My heart rate dropped, until I saw something move in the pitch black in front of me. At the same time, the scraping sound struck again. I froze and instinctively turned off my flashlight. I guess I thought that at least in the dark I couldn't be seen. I sat for a few moments paralyzed, with the extinguished and fading flashlight still pointed forward in my hand. Then, using my uninjured leg, I pushed myself up against the wall in an attempt to stand up. After getting to my feet, all the time staring out into the impenetrable darkness for movement or sound, I found that the knee of one of my legs was so bad that I could not support it. Maniacally, I started humming to myself, just so it wouldn't be so quiet. I limped out to the point in the room where the now broken door was directly above, and yelled at Jonas as loud as I could, but heard nothing in response. He must be still by the car, still looking for that rope. Still humming, and with an almost unbearably high pulse, I moved back to the cement wall, leaned against it, and slowly began to walk along it. After stumbling forward for what felt like 3 feet, my head slammed into something sticking out from the wall. The pain was blinding, amplified by the concussion, and I lost my balance and tumbled to the floor. I dropped the flashlight and pressed my hands to my forehead, feeling something wet and warm there. I searched with my fingers for a wound but found nothing. With the other hand, I began to sweep along the ground in search of the flashlight, straightening my back against the wall. The flashlight appeared on the ground, and I pulled it up and shone it on the ground next to me, where I had just been lying. The floor was wet, discolored by the liquid I felt on my forehead. I stared down at the pool in confusion, and just as I decided it must be my blood, I saw a droplet sail down through the air and land in the pool with a plop. Against my will, an inevitable realization began to form in my head. I turned the flashlight up to the ceiling. Another murky drop passed through the beam of light before finally finding the source of where they came from. A rusty, cracked pipe that jutted a few inches from the wall and ended in a bare shower head that was aimed down at the ground. You know, the feeling when your stomach kind of implodes? In that situation, I think it literally did. Out of terror and pain and effort, before I could do anything about it, I threw up. Straight out, it splashed onto my shoes and pants. I straightened my back, and with my hands against the wall, began limping sideways as fast as I could. Around me, sounds began to be heard, but I wasn't sure if they were caused by myself or something else. After a few seconds of rushing, a new shower head appeared in front of me, which I managed to dodge. It was sitting a little higher than the last one, but seemed to be leaking the same liquid. I continued along the wall, which felt endless, and repeatedly had to duck for new showers that jutted out. With each shower, the liquid seemed to flow more and more, but at the same time was a little too thick to be able to get out of the small holes of the shower unimpeded. The room started to smell. I was struck by the memory of how Mike Johansson had described the scent, and struggled on with the t-shirt pressed up over my nose and mouth. It stank of shit, like vomit, like burnt hair, like something was rotting. As I was still moving forward, leaning against the wall, I fell helplessly forward when the wall suddenly ended. I landed on a dirt floor, and even though the adrenaline dulled some of the pain, it was still felt. With the flashlight convulsively in my hand, I twisted around to understand where I had ended up. Behind me was a doorway, where a door hung ajar towards me. It was nice if a little aged, and had a nice door handle and a door knocker. The red paint flaked and collected in little piles on the ground by my legs. I got to my feet, or at least my foot, and limped on into the corridor I had fallen into. I narrowly avoided hitting my head on a sheet of metal hanging 3/4 of the way down from the ceiling. After only a few feet, I fell to my knees and had to crawl instead of jumping forward on one leg. Sheet metal ran along the walls and ceiling, and at regular intervals the ceiling was propped up by wooden beams that seemed to hold this makeshift tunnel together. I didn't dare lean against the walls because I might cut myself on the rusty metal, or topple a beam and end up under the collapsing roof. So I had to crawl for what felt like a mile, though I knew it wasn't that far. Every now and then I bumped into a wall as the corridor twisted and turned. I had no idea where I was in relation to the room I had fallen into, but I repeated, like a mantra, that there must be a door at the end of this tunnel. By the way, if I hadn't crawled, I would have probably hit the ceiling, which was only a few feet high from time to time. The only reason it hadn't collapsed yet was that the sheet metal was holding it up. Someone had purposely built the passage like that. Of course, I didn't think of this at the time. Then I just crawled forward and told myself that I was alone in the tunnel, even though I periodically heard rushing footsteps on the floor just inches behind me. Every now and then my jeans brushed against my legs, and it sometimes felt like someone was touching me. Maybe someone did. To this day, I don't know. I crawled and crawled and crawled until I came to an uphill in the tunnel. I looked up and saw, to my immense relief, a cellar door. It was made of wood, and between the cracks I saw a white light outside. It could be from the car lights out there, I thought. But most of all, I was glad to have finally found out. I crawled up to the door and threw myself shoulder first into the door. It creaked and shook, but did not open. I gave up a shrill scream for Jonas, but it was stifled by a searing pain in my throat. At most, I could only burst out in a rasping cry, and I heard for myself that it sounded like a dying animal. I slumped by the door, exhausted from the pain and exertion, and stared helplessly at the light streaming in through the slits. I was so close to being freed that I could smell the summer night out there. In this moment of silent collapse, I finally heard a sound in the tunnel that, without the slightest doubt, was something moving. It sounded like something was being dragged across the ground. It hurried forward, paused for a second, and then hurried on. With an effort, I straightened up, sat up against the door, and put the hand with the flashlight on my leg so it wouldn't shake. To this day, I cannot explain what I saw. I know I saw it, but I can't seem to convince myself that it was real. I return again and again to the only conceivable explanation, that I was hallucinating. In the darkness some distance away in the tunnel stood a child, dressed in a dirty nightgown. The linen was stained with something dark brown, in some places deep red. The child was extremely small and frail, like in those pictures of children from concentration camps. Through the long tangled hair that hung in front of the face and reached down to the dirty fingertips, I saw the light of my flashlight reflected in one eye. The boy or the girl, I don't know what, moved forward with great effort. Not that it was panting or breathing deeply, but it seemed that every muscle movement required all the energy the kid had left in its body. But what filled me with icy horror was that eye. As I said, it was only visible between the strands of hair, but I saw the anger in the eye. It glowed with anger, or even hatred. I kind of can't put it into words, but I just knew that this kid wanted me bad. And whether it was a hallucination or not, the child kept getting closer. I started sobbing. As I stared at the child, who was getting closer and closer, I heard a whisper behind me. "Jack," said the voice through the cracks in the door. It was Jonas. It must be Jonas. I coughed in shock, swallowed, and tried to answer him. "Open the door and get me out of here," I tried to say, but I think it just sounded like snotty rustling. I tore my eyes from the child, slapped the door with my palms, and felt the flashlight roll off my leg and down the hill in front of the basement door. It stopped somewhere at the children's feet. "What do you see?" asked the voice. "What are you talking about?" I muttered, narrowing my eyes. The voice replied something along the lines of, "Just look, tell me what you see." But I don't know, because I started howling in desperate tears. Then the voice whispered, "Get some rest. I will fix it." I didn't understand anything but kept closing my eyes. "Please, Jonas, open the door." "Get me out of here," I sobbed. I had regained some of my voice and barked, "Open the damn door, Jonas!" In frustration, I opened my eyes and was greeted by black strands of hair hanging inches in front of my face. In the midst of the tangles, the light from outside the door was reflected in something. I narrowed my eyes again and screamed at the top of my voice, "Open the damn door!" when it suddenly gave way behind my back. I fell backwards into the earth, took a breath of fresh night air, and crawled backwards a few feet with my eyes closed. With my feet, I kicked the basement door shut, and then I collapsed on the ground and looked up. A short distance away was the barn, illuminated by the car's headlights. My head throbbed with pain. I was dirty and wet all over, stained by something I didn't know and didn't want to know what it was. My knee was dislocated, if not worse. I turned around and once again felt my stomach clench when I realized that no one was there. The only thing I saw was the shrubbery some distance away. I felt the anger rising. "Jonas, come out of the bushes!" I sat up and was just about to get to my feet when I heard a shout from the barn. The light from a flashlight flickered by as Jonas came running from the car through the open sliding barn door and shouted that he was on his way with the rope and that I shouldn't worry. I must have passed out then, because I woke up later to find Jonas standing above me and shaking me to life. I didn't understand what he was saying, but he helped me up and off to the car. As we limped away, I turned and looked back at the basement door. There, outside the door, was my flashlight. Its light faded, as if its batteries were about to die. Once in the car, I fell asleep at once. Jonas says he drove around for an hour before he found the highway, and then he drove me to a hospital in Silkeborg. I don't think I ever told him what happened down there in the hallways. In any case, he didn't ask about what happened, and soon after our trip we drifted apart and lost contact. Not on purpose, but we just stopped calling each other after that trip. I have never quite been able to understand what happened that night. Some things can be explained away, like hallucinations, but not all. I saw the shower heads, and they were leaking a liquid I didn't recognize. The door was real, the tunnel as well. The other, the scary part, I can with some goodwill blame on my concussion. These days, I drink quite a lot. I try to convince myself that I was just so lost, so shocked, that it was all in my head. I know I will never set foot in Denmark again. I'm still a skeptic, but I think I really was part of something down there among the showers that Mike Johansson once told me about. Because that basement door was actually locked at first, and then suddenly it wasn't locked anymore. I can't have made that up. So that's it for today. I hope you liked the story, and thanks for sticking around until the end. If this gave you chills, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and there are plenty more eerie tales on the way. Until next time, stay curious, but maybe not too curious.